Thank you all, and I'd like to thank the Alabama Department of Archives and History for inviting me today, and thank you all for joining us today. It's very humbling to see a crowd of this size come and listen to what I have to say. I'm sure it's not just me that's the subject. And speaking of the subject, I will be talking on the Battle of Horseshoe Bend today. It's an interesting topic for many reasons, one of which, and I want to say this from the beginning before I forget and we run out of time today, we are upon the bicentennial of the subject. We're nearing the end of the bicentennial of the Creek Indian War. Maybe many of y'all participated in events earlier in the subject back in 2013, a very large event down at Fort Mims, which you could say sort of inaugurates the event. We are right at the end now. And for the next few days into the end of next week, we've got a series of activities taking place sponsored by Horseshoe Bend National Military Park. Starting tomorrow, Friday and Saturday on the Auburn University campus, there's a symposium covering the subjects surrounding the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And then at the end of next week, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, Thursday being the actual 200-year anniversary of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, there's a series of programs at the park. I feel it's important to make that announcement. It's an event that I've spent nearly 18 years looking forward to planning, participating in, and as fate would have it, I won't be there well, I will be there, but I won't be there as part of the behind-the-scenes organization of the event. Arguably, March 27th, 1814 is one of the most important days in Alabama history. Certainly, I feel that way. And most of us, I would say, know something of the subject. It's the Creek Indian War, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. In some ways, it's a complicated topic, especially the origins of the Creek War. And I will not spend too much time discussing the origins of the war today. That in and of itself warrants a talk alone. Well, suffice it to say, the Creek Indian War begins as a civil war within the Creek Indian Nation. Throughout the early part, first half of 1813, it begins to move out of the confines of a civil war in July of 1813 with the small battle of Burnt Corn Creek between an element of Red Sticks returning from Pensacola, attacked by Mississippi Territory militia at Burnt Corn Creek. In retaliation, the Red Sticks will launch a large attack on the frontier fortification, Fort Mims, down near Mobile. August 30th, 1813, we have the attack on Fort Mims. Now, the Creek War moves from being a relatively localized conflict. It's a national conflict from this point on. From August 30th on, it becomes a national subject of attention. Excuse me. Fort Mims makes the war a war between the United States and the Creek Nation. And what we have, federal government will order 3 campaigns, essentially. We have the Tennessee campaign. That, of course, is our primary subject today. Coming from the north, most of the activity will follow the route of the Coosa River as it moves south into what we consider Alabama. Now, we also have important campaigns to the east. The Georgia campaign. The major battles of the Georgia campaign we'll see are Atossee, Calebi Creek. A portion of the Georgia militia will also attack the town site that's contained within Horseshoe Bend National Military Park today, the town of New Yucca. The warriors from that town will fight at Horseshoe Bend. Now, when Georgia militia attacks in December of 1813 at New Yucca, the town has been vacated. We'll touch on perhaps that story in a little bit. Another important campaign coming from the south up the Alabama River, fought by the Mississippi Territory. The principal engagement is, of course, Holy Ground, not terribly far from where we are today. in time, and even at the time that these events take place, I would say that perhaps the greatest attention goes to the Tennessee campaigns. And of course, the name Andrew Jackson, which everyone is familiar with at this point. Jackson quickly becomes the principal figure of this Tennessee campaign. And I mentioned that a lot of the activity is going to follow the Coosa River. Initially, Fort Strother is built, and from Fort Strother, battles are fought. We have Tallusahatchee, Talladega in the fall of 1813, and then followed up with a campaign that in some ways is perhaps the most interesting campaign of the Creek War. Doesn't necessarily get the attention it deserves. The campaign that sees the battles of Emuckfaw Creek and Initachopko Creek. Those battles will take place in Tallapoosa County. Emuckfaw Creek, January 22nd, 1814. Initachopko Creek, 2 days later, on the 24th, right along what today would be close to the county line, up in the north part of Tallapoosa County. Now, the reason why I find those two engagements so important and interesting is the fact that, for the most part, both sides, Jackson's army and then the Red Sticks that will attack him at Emuckfaw Creek, the numbers are relatively even. And it is somewhat of an open field fight. A lot of the battles of the Creek War, especially in Jackson's campaigns, are fought over fixed positions. A town is attacked, looking at Tallusahatchee, Talladega, ultimately Horseshoe Bend. Jackson will attack a fixed position. The Emuckfaw Creek and Initachopko Creek are open battles. The Red Sticks will leave their position at Horseshoe Bend and attack him at Emuckfaw Creek, about 1.5 miles away from the Tohopka village. Now, let me just say I'm teaching myself to pronounce the village built within the 100-acre bend, Tohopka. You probably have heard it called Topeka or something to that effect. And where I'm able to, I'm trying to adopt at least today's way that these names are pronounced by Creek folk. I think it adds more of an interesting element to say them in that manner. Manawa, a name that we're going to talk a lot more about in a bit, but that's probably the way you've heard it pronounced. So I will probably, for the most part today, refer to that as Manawa rather than Menawa. Menawa is the common pronunciation that we hear here. So Manawa and Menawa, the same individual. Okay, in those fights, you can view the Emuckfaw Creek and Initachopko Creek as draws. Essentially, not a clear victor on either side. However, probably if you look at it with a military analysis, Jackson might have the upper hand because he retains the initiative. He decides when to break contact, and he continues his retreat route, ultimately back to Fort Strother on the Coosa. The importance, and why I've sort of lingered on the subject for a few minutes, is that they're a learning experience for Jackson. All good military commanders should learn from their experiences in the field. What he learns from that is that an army of 1,000 men attacking the fortified position in Horseshoe Bend is too weak. During that battle on the 22nd, the Emuckfaw Creek fight, an element of his force, led by John Coffey, another name that probably many are familiar with, actually sees or conducts a reconnaissance of the log barricade that's built fortifying, sealing off the neck of the Horseshoe Bend Peninsula. At that point, he returns to Jackson, engaged in the fight at Emuckfaw Creek, and says, there's no way with your strength of 1,000 people you can attack that position. It's far too strong. Jackson takes that advice and will break contact and head back to the Coosa. Okay, we will leave that thread hanging for a minute or several minutes. Let's go back and look at the other side of the barricade. Why have the Red Stick Creeks chosen this interesting position on the Tallapoosa River? Now, I'll have to apologize. I do not know the current Creek way of pronouncing that position. In my way of saying, it's called Chilocco Litabixi. The horse's flat foot, the Horseshoe Bend. About a 100-acre peninsula on the upper Tallapoosa. Why have they chosen a position that, with our hindsight, seems like an obvious trap? Okay. In the fall of 1813, we don't know exactly when, could be in October. Somewhere at that point, in the middle of the fall of 1813, Red Stick leadership will meet to decide how to best defend their area against this three-pronged campaign. Again, Tennessee from the north, Georgia from the east, and the Mississippi Territory from the south. The experience shows that each town left to its own defenses or relying on the handful of warriors. And 200 warriors is a fairly substantial town. 200 people against, let's say, 800 to 1,200 soldiers. This does not make for good odds. So the idea is to pool the strength, pool the collective defense to have better success. At least three areas that we can look into the records to determine are chosen. Holy ground, mentioned that as the objective for the Mississippi Territory campaign. To our west, holy ground. That's one area. Another is on the lower Tallapoosa. We mentioned the town of Atosi, or the Atosi towns. That's another area of collective defense. Fairly high population density down in that region. The other is, of course, on the upper Tallapoosa, up there at the Horseshoe Bend. The people of 6 towns will gather for defense. The dominant town in that area is the town of Okfuskee, today under Lake Martin. The other towns are, okay, we have the 6, Okfuskee, Okchaya, Nuyaka, Hillaby, Fish Ponds, and Eufaula. Those 6 towns will pool the strength and develop a standalone example of Indian defense. The barricade, that 400-yard long barricade that seals the neck of the peninsula is an incredible fortification. Now, I'm apparently forgetting that I've got slides for you to look at, haven't I? So I get so caught up in my own sound of my own. Here we have the Horseshoe Bend. There it is, the 100-acre peninsula. We can see I actually have a pointer, a laser pointer right here. And you can see the flow of the river carries us from east to west, essentially, as it flows down into Lake Martin today. And the river has created this bend, Chilocco Litabixi, the horse's flatfoot. The people of 6 towns, we mentioned Nuyaka. Nuyaka is centered in this neighborhood right there. The town of Tohopeka is built in the center. On the surface, it does look for a smart position. The river acts as an obstacle. It does protect that town. And as we'll see, it also creates a trap. But the people of the surrounding area will gather for defense and across this narrow neck, which is about 400 yards long or wide, a very strong fortification is built. We'll go into detail on that. Linking the neck to the village of Tohopeka, about 1,000 yards in between, is a series of secondary fortified positions. We don't hear about those a lot in the traditional stories. If you read anything about the battle in your history books at some point in your schooling, you're not going to learn about this. But it seems that there was a scheme to the defensive work, hold this front line, and this is actually in keeping with pretty much standard modern military procedure, hold the front line when the point is necessary, retire from the first line of fortification, take up this checkerboard of scattered redoubts as a secondary fighting position, all designed to buy time to allow non-combatants to escape. Now, To some extent, that is my interpretation of the scheme of defense. Because I will not stand here and tell you today that I think they expected to defeat an attacking army at that barricade. I think, given the responsibilities of, we'll show him in just a minute, Manawa, he has to not only deal with an attacking army, but also deal for the protection of a great number of non-combatants. We do not know how many total Red Stick Creeks are gathered in that bend. On the day of the battle, from a Cherokee woman prisoner who's liberated at the end of the day, she says 1,000 warriors gathered for defense. Cherokee and Creek allies serving with Jackson's army will take away from that battlefield 350 women and children. Okay, so we have somewhere right now with those two numbers, a little less than 1,500 people gathered. Chances are a greater number had originally been there, but further downriver, there's a congregation point. For anybody who got away that day, they were to meet at Elkahatchee Creek. And that is, in fact, where the people who do escape will collect at. All right. Now, as the weeks of the fall of 1813, I keep wanting to say 2013, that's a problem I have. 1813, as they roll along, and this position is set up for defense and fortified, and as people come into the Tohotka site, which really takes on almost a refugee camp. You can call it a village. In recent years, I've been thinking of it more as a refugee site where people from the surrounding area have gathered. This is a painting that was done for Horseshoe Bend National Military Park in 1965 and was part of the first series of wayside exhibits on that battlefield. And what I do like about this, even though there's some obvious issues with the painting that we have fault with today. The dress isn't necessarily, of these gentlemen, the dress is a little not in keeping with our standards today of what Southeastern men might have worn. We see mostly log cabins. There could have been some. There could have very well been some, and most of them are described as log huts of sorts. I think we probably would have seen some other structures, maybe lean-tos, something that was of a very temporary nature, because essentially this is a winter encampment. Now, but what's so good about this painting is that it's taken, when you view this, when today it's back out in a slightly different format at Tour Stop 4. When you stand at the overlook where these men are just starting to walk down, you look out across the village site to the Tallapoosa River, and it gives you a nice perspective. This painting gives you that perspective from a high ground looking out across the plain to the river. It's atmospheric, and it's as atmospheric today as it was in 1965. Manawa, the great warrior. He is given the responsibility as the principal war leader of that battlefield, of that area. Now, in a system similar to our own, he does not have final authority. His leadership is split, or you could even say hampered by another figure. That is Manahi, the principal prophet on that field. Manahi retained overall leadership. So you could say civilian leadership has the final authority over military leadership. Though Manawa is essentially responsible for the conduct of the defense of that field. And of course, he will not only organize the defenses, as far as we know, he is certainly the primary leadership role of the 1,000 Red Stick Warriors. He himself, though, as people in this point in time, military leaders, becomes engaged in the fight. Now, certainly not all military figures are going to be fighting up close in the thick of the fight, but Manawa is there. He will ultimately be wounded 7 times before he leaves that battlefield. The final time, shot through the mouth, and with the bullet entering and exiting through either cheek. Andrew Jackson. Jackson, of course, brings that army to the field. Now, as the place is fortified, as it develops, They've had that initial contact up at Muckfall Creek in January. As Jackson leaves the area, returns to the Coosa River, his army disintegrates. Jackson commands 3 different armies during the Creek War, which is actually nothing out of the ordinary. Typical militia enlistments, or actually I should say terms of service in the field, last for about 3 months. So that army will replace itself. The third and final one is the one that will fight that penultimate battle at Horseshoe Bend. One difference is he has taken the pains to have a much larger army. By the time he leaves Fort Strother and moves south on the Coosa River to a place very near modern-day Sylacauga, he has 5,000, well, in total, he's in command of 5,000 men. Many are left at Fort Strother. Many are put to the task of building Fort Williams there near Sylacauga. He will take 3,300 to the Horseshoe Bend battlefield. Essentially, that army consists of the bulk Tennessee militia, around 2,000 men. He has been augmented by 550 if you count all the officers, regular soldiers, the 39th United States Infantry Regiment from the state of Tennessee. Just weeks and months before, these men are most likely members of the Tennessee militia. So they are Tennesseans, very much so. But they are regulars. And when they enlist, they're making the commitment that they can be used in ways that militia soldiers can't. Jackson has found that the militia is not necessarily the best assault force for conducting battle. The 39th will be a different story. We'll talk more about the 39th in just a few minutes. Very importantly, he also has the services of 600 Allied warriors, 500 Cherokee warriors, 100 Creek warriors. The Creek are under the command of a very famous name, William McIntosh. I think there's a painting of William McIntosh in here somewhere, isn't there? Gideon Morgan is the commander of the Cherokee Regiment. And this Cherokee Regiment and Creek Company are organized on very similar lines to Jackson's Tennessee militia and United States regular forces. Okay, with those 3,300 men, he retraces his steps to the Horseshoe Bend battlefield and possibly in the vicinity of modern-day New Site, little town about 5 miles north of Horseshoe Bend, he makes his encampment. Another lesson he's learned from the January 22nd. He's no longer camping 1.5 miles away. He pulls back to perhaps 5 to 6 miles back, a safe distance. And on the morning, Sunday morning, March 27th, he splits his army. A risky military move in the face of the enemy, but he takes that chance. Splits his army roughly in a 1/3 force and a 2/3 force. The 1/3 is commanded by John Coffey, and we would maybe consider that the light or rapid movement brigade. Every man in that force is mounted, either singly or doubly on a horse, maybe a mule, but mostly horse. And what they will do, let's see if we can get another map of sorts here. I want to say something about this map, hopefully, in just a minute. But as Jackson moves south with his 2/3 force, which will become the battering ram of the barricade right here, Coffey will cross the Tallapoosa to the south, about 2 miles to the south of Tohoka. And as you can see from these arrows, will position his force. We have Tennessee militia going to Beans Island, a 15-acre island in the middle of the river. The main force under Coffey will actually be positioned facing away from the battlefield. What's important about this force? The Tennessee portion are all armed with rifles. In fact, usually in the map or in the documents, they're considered sometimes Tennessee riflemen. They're mostly, if not entirely, armed with rifles. Now, only one element in the beginning is facing the battlefield. This force is facing outwards to protect the battlefield from possible attack, to close off that battlefield. That's the idea. Protect the battlefield while Jackson conducts the battlefield in the center. At this point in time, he has no idea that pretty much all the warrior strength is already gathered in this bend. So he's concerned about possible attack. Now, the Cherokee and Creek allies will cross this ridge. It's that ridge that, in fact, will make this Horseshoe Bend. It's a ridge that essentially rings the village of Tohotka. The Cherokee position themselves right here. You see the arrow that they will cross by. The Creek force, almost at the toe of the bend. Their mission is to stay in place and make sure no one escapes from the battlefield. Essentially what you have is a hammer, the main force, against the anvil, the Cherokee and Creek allies. Hammer and anvil. Kill everything in the center. It's a fairly simple concept. Contain the enemy and destroy them. That's the idea. That's his plan. Now, as we know, that's not how the story of the day is going to play out. Everybody is in position at 10:30, about 10:30 in the morning. Both elements have gotten where they need to be. A musket shot echoes from the south here to let Jackson know that this force has gotten into its place. At that point, the two small cannons, a 6-pounder and a 3-pounder, their primary purpose on a battlefield in this point in time is to shoot against people, not a 400-yard log wall that is in some places as high as 8 feet. As it's described to us, the log consists entirely of pine trees, but only about 4 to 5 layers of logs, one on top of each other, to make that 5 to 8 feet height. So we're talking logs of about 18 inches in diameter or so. Very stout logs. 6-pounder and 3-pounder shot have no effect on that wall. And for a period of almost 2 hours, they will fire between them about 72 shot. The cannonballs will either go completely through or just sink right in. But the idea of knocking a hole or breaching the obstacle, as we might say today, does not happen. 6-pounder and 3-pounder shot are not heavy enough to unseat these huge logs. An image of a painting that is out there on the battlefield today. You can see from the illustration, these are large pine trees. Those shot sinking into the wall have no effect. Back to the map. Here we have the Horseshoe Bend. There it is, the 100-acre peninsula. We can see the tower. I actually have a pointer, a laser pointer right here. And you can see the flow of the river carries us from east to west, essentially, as it flows down into Lake Martin today. And the river has created this bend, Chilocca Littipixie, the Horse's Flatfoot. The people of 6 towns, we mentioned New Yucca. New Yucca is centered in this neighborhood right there. The town of Tohotka is built in the center. On the surface, it does look for a smart position. The river acts as an obstacle. It does protect that town. And as we'll see, it also creates a trap. But the people of the surrounding area will gather for defense and across this narrow neck, which is about 400 yards long or wide, a very strong fortification is built. We'll go into detail on that. Linking the neck to the village of Tohotka, about 1,000 yards in between, is a series of secondary fortified positions. We don't hear about those a lot in the traditional stories. If you read anything about the battle in your history books at some point in your schooling, you're not going to learn about this. But it seems that there was a scheme to the defensive work. Hold this front line, and this is actually in keeping with pretty much standard modern military procedure. hold the front line when the point is necessary, retire from the first line of fortification, take up this checkerboard of scattered redoubts as a secondary fighting position, all designed to buy time to allow non-combatants to escape. Now, to some extent, that is my interpretation of the scheme of defense, because I will not stand here and tell you today that I think they expected to defeat an attacking army at that barricade. I think, given the responsibilities of, we'll show him just a minute, Manawa, he has to not only deal with an attacking army, but also deal for the protection of a great number of non-combatants. We do not know how many total Red Stick Creeks are gathered in that bend. On the day of the battle, from a Cherokee woman prisoner who's liberated at the end of the day, she says 1,000 warriors gathered for defense. Cherokee and Creek allies serving with Jackson's army will take away from that battlefield 350 women and children. Okay, so we have somewhere right now with those two numbers, a little less than 1,500 people gathered. Chances are a greater number had originally been there, but further downriver, there's a congregation point. For anybody who got away that day, they were to meet at Elkahatchee Creek. And that is, in fact, where the people who do escape will collect at. All right. Now, as the weeks of the fall of 1813, I keep wanting to say 2013, that's the problem I have. 1813, as they roll along, and this position is set up for defense and fortified, and as people come into the Tohotka site, which really takes on almost a refugee camp, but you can call it a village. In recent years, I've been thinking of it more as a refugee site where people from the surrounding area have gathered. This is a painting that was done for Horseshoe Bend National Military Park in 1965 and was part of the first series of wayside exhibits on that battlefield. And what I do like about this, even though there's some obvious issues with the painting that we have fault with today. The dress isn't necessarily, of these gentlemen, the dress is a little not in keeping with our standards today of what Southeastern men might have worn. We see mostly log cabins. There could have been some. There could have very well been some, and most of them are described as log huts of sorts. I think we probably would have seen some other structures, maybe lean-tos, something that was of a very temporary nature, because essentially this is a winter encampment. Now, but what's so good about this painting is that it's taken, when you view this, when today it's back out in a slightly different format at Tour Stop 4. When you stand at the overlook where these men are just starting to walk down, you look out across the village site to the Tallapoosa River, and it gives you a nice perspective. This painting gives you that perspective from a high ground looking out across the plain to the river. It's atmospheric, and it's as atmospheric today as it was in 1965. Manawa, the great warrior. He is given the responsibility as the principal war leader of that battlefield, of that area. Now, in a system similar to our own, he does not have final authority. His leadership is split, or you could even say hampered by another figure. That is Manahi, the principal prophet on that field. Manahi retained overall leadership. So you could say civilian leadership has the final authority over military leadership. The Manawa is essentially responsible for the conduct of the defense of that field. And of course, he will not only organize the defenses, as far as we know, he is certainly the primary leadership role of the 1,000 Red Stick Warriors. He himself, though, as people in this point in time, military leaders, becomes engaged in the fight. Now, certainly not all military figures are going to be fighting up close in the thick of the fight, but Manawa is there. He will ultimately be wounded 7 times before he leaves that battlefield. The final time, shot through the mouth, and with the bullet entering and exiting through either cheek. Andrew Jackson. Jackson, of course, brings that army to the field. Now, as the place is fortified, as it develops, they've had that initial contact up at Muckfall Creek in January. As Jackson leaves the area, returns to the Coosa River, his army disintegrates. Jackson commands 3 different armies during the Creek War, which is actually nothing out of the ordinary. Typical militia enlistments, or actually I should say terms of service in the field, last for about 3 months. So that army will replace itself. The third and final one is the one that will fight that penultimate battle at Horseshoe Bend. One difference is he has taken the pains to have a much larger army. By the time he leaves Fort Strother and moves south on the Coosa River to a place very near modern-day Sylacauga, he has 5,000, well, in total, he's in command of 5,000 men. Many are left at Fort Strother. Many are put to the task of building Fort Williams there near Sylacauga. He will take 3,300 to the Horseshoe Bend battlefield. Essentially, that army consists of the bulk Tennessee militia, around 2,000 men. He has been augmented by 550 if you count all the officers, regular soldiers, the 39th United States Infantry Regiment from the state of Tennessee. Just weeks and months before, these men are most likely members of the Tennessee militia. So they are Tennesseans, very much so. But they are regulars. And when they enlist, they're making the commitment that they can be used in ways that militia soldiers can't. Jackson has found that the militia is not necessarily the best assault force for conducting battle. The 39th will be a different story. We'll talk more about the 39th in just a few minutes. Very importantly, he also has the services of 600 Allied warriors, 500 Cherokee warriors, 100 Creek warriors. The Creek are under the command of a very famous name, William McIntosh. I think there's a painting of William McIntosh in here somewhere, isn't there? Gideon Morgan is the commander of the Cherokee Regiment. And this Cherokee Regiment and Creek Company are organized on very similar lines to Jackson's Tennessee militia and United States regular forces. Okay, with those 3,300 men, he retraces his steps to the Horseshoe Bend battlefield and possibly in the vicinity of modern-day New Site, little town about 5 miles north of Horseshoe Bend, he makes his encampment. Another lesson he's learned from the January 22nd. He's no longer camping 1.5 miles away. He pulls back to perhaps 5 to 6 miles back, a safe distance. And on the morning, Sunday morning, March 27th, he splits his army. A risky military move in the face of the enemy, but he takes that chance. Splits his army roughly in a 1/3 force and a 2/3 force. The 1/3 is commanded by John Coffey, and we would maybe consider that the light or rapid movement brigade. Every man in that force is mounted, either singly or doubly on a horse, maybe a mule, but mostly horse. And what they will do, let's see if we can get another map of sorts here. I'm going to say something about this map, hopefully, in just a minute. But as Jackson moves south with his 2/3 force, which will become the battering ram of the barricade right here, Coffey will cross the Tallapoosa to the south, about 2 miles to the south of Tohoka. And as you can see from these arrows, will position his force. We have Tennessee militia going to Beans Island, a 15-acre island in the middle of the river. The main force under Coffey will actually be positioned facing away from the battlefield. What's important about this force? The Tennessee portion are all armed with rifles. In fact, usually in the map or in the documents, they're considered sometimes Tennessee riflemen. They're mostly, if not entirely, armed with rifles. Now, only one element in the beginning is facing the battlefield. This force is facing outwards to protect the battlefield from possible attack, to close off that battlefield. That's the idea. Protect the battlefield while Jackson conducts the battlefield in the center. At this point in time, he has no idea that pretty much all the warrior strength is already gathered in this bend. So he's concerned about possible attack. Now, the Cherokee and Creek allies will cross this ridge. It's that ridge that, in fact, will make this Horseshoe Bend. It's a ridge that essentially rings the village of Tohopka. The Cherokee position themselves right here. You see the arrow that they will cross by. The Creek force, almost at the toe of the bend. Their mission is to stay in place and make sure no one escapes from the battlefield. Essentially, what you have is a hammer, the main force, against the anvil, the Cherokee and Creek allies. Hammer and anvil. Kill everything in the center. It's a fairly simple concept. Contain the enemy and destroy them. That's the idea. That's his plan. Now, as we know, that's not how the story of the day is going to play out. Everybody's in position at 10:30, about 10:30 in the morning. Both elements have gotten where they need to be. A musket shot echoes from the south here to let Jackson know that this force has gotten into its place. At that point, the two small cannons, a 6-pounder and a 3-pounder, their primary purpose on a battlefield in this point in time is to shoot against people, not a 400-yard log wall that is in some places as high as 8 feet. As it's described to us, the log consists entirely of pine trees, but only about 4 to 5 layers of logs, one on top of each other, to make that 5 to 8 feet height. So we're talking logs of about 18 inches in diameter or so. Very stout logs. 6-pounder and 3-pounder shot have no effect on that wall. And for a period of almost 2 hours, they will fire between them about 72 shot. The cannonballs will either go completely through or just sink right in. But the idea of knocking a hole or breaching the obstacle, as we might say today, does not happen. 6-pounder and 3-pounder shot are not heavy enough to unseat these huge logs. An image of a painting that is out there on the battlefield today. You can see from the illustration, these are large pine trees. Those shot sinking into the wall have no effect. Back to the map. This is a brand new map that was made by an intern at Horseshoe Bend National Military Park this summer. It is being debuted today, as a matter of fact, publicly. And for those who will participate in the symposium Friday and Saturday at the Auburn University Conference Center, will have the opportunity to purchase this map. It's also on sale at the Visitor Center, so I'm still advertising for the National Park Service quickly for a minute there. Creek and Cherokee allies. They hear the firing going back and forth. The Red Stick defenders will focus their fire upon the cannoneers of those two guns. The cannoneers will, of course, fire those shot. For men across river to the south here, not visually seeing the action, they hear what they think is the battle in progress, and they become impatient to get involved in the fight. It's hard to say with precision what was the initial thought that said, let's cross the river. But at least 3 men, 3 Cherokee warriors will move into the water, swim across, and with these dugout canoes lining the banks on the Tohopka side, they come up with the idea, we'll take these canoes, bring them back, load them with more warriors, back and forth, and essentially ferry all of the warrior strength of the Cherokee and Creek Cherokee Regiment here, Creek Company there, across into the village of Tohotka. Now, why would they want to get into the fight? Seems kind of a strange concept. Why would you really want to get into battle if your mission is to stay on the relatively safe side and just fire across as necessary? One idea that was proposed to me some years ago, which makes perfect sense, is that most of the men on this side, within the Cherokee force, they've not really gained a warrior's name. They haven't gained honors in battle yet. They're essentially holding names that really don't have the weight of the warrior ethos. It's important. They need to gain some more honor. They need to be locked in that combat to move forward in their development in life. And it makes a certain amount of sense. That may have been the initial instigator that propelled them across that river. The point is, the important thing to consider, it happens almost simultaneously. The Cherokee will cross first, closely followed by McIntosh's Creek warriors. Initially, the village of Tohotka is almost entirely undefended. The warrior strength is here at the barricade. As they cross through the village and begin to torch the huts, they're basically facing non-combatants. Relatively quickly, the Red Stick warriors will become aware of this attack from the rear and will split their strength. About half moving south to defend their families in the bottom of the peninsula. And at that point, as the fight picks up in what is referred to as the high ground in the reports after the battle, the Red Stick warriors are on the verge of defeating the Cherokee and Creek allies that have crossed. But at that moment, Jackson halts the cannonade on the barricade. He realizes that he will take advantage of the opportunity that's been presented. He sees the Red Sticks leaving the barricade. He actually sees his own warriors, Cherokee and Creek allies, because they're identifiable by the white deer's tails in their hair or in their headdress, which was an order that he had penned prior to the battle. All allied warriors will, as a flash of distinction, will wear something white in their hair so that we can tell friend from foe. And of course, he will see smoke rising up above the trees from the Tohotka site. Halts the cannonade, and around noon, somewhere between 12 and 12:15, he orders the long roll to be beat. That is, of course, the charge. You know, we think of TV with the cavalry bugles. It's the same thing, except beat on the drum. The long roll. When the soldiers hear the drums rolling, they know what is imminent. That is, the advance to contact. And in this painting here that was placed on the battlefield about 2005, it's the current system of wayside exhibits there at the park. You see the initial contact at the barricade. Again, this wall was exceptional in its strength. Very large logs, well defended by sharpened stakes to the front. And as you can see, portholes at 2 levels cut for firing through. Not, of course, for Jackson's troops to fire through, but for the Red Sticks to fire through. Now, the 39th will change their formation from a firing line to sections of assault. And that's what we have illustrated for you. Bodies of the 39th moving forward. You have mostly enlisted men, soldiers portrayed here, attacking the barricade. You have a field grade officer, perhaps Major Peacock, who was the second major of the regiment. Major Montgomery, and probably somebody that we don't need to introduce too much here, since the county of Montgomery is named for him. He has just been killed out of our sight at one of the further ends of that barricade. He is one, according to the reports, which of course are probably going to, your highest ranking officer killed is probably going to get the distinction of being the first man on the barricade. Who knows if that's true or not, but according to the report, he is one of the first to approach the barricade, fires his pistol through a porthole, and is immediately shot in the head with an answering bullet. falls dead and is the highest ranking individual from Jackson's army who will be killed that day, and the only known burial on the battlefield. The fighting at the barricade is intense. Relatively brief, it is the bloodiest few minutes of that battle. And as you can see, the 39th begins as they approach, they scale the wall, and we have the opposite perspective. Behind that barricade, in defense, we have the Red Stick Warriors. Again, we see the portholes cut for their use to fire from standing, from kneeling positions. We have the 39th beginning to cross. We have several weapons illustrated in this image. This is important because the Red Sticks are at a fairly serious disadvantage in this fight. Not only are they outnumbered 3-1 on this day, the odds are much worse in their favor because of weaponry. We do have firearms evident here. Perhaps 1/3, maybe 300 to 350 of the 1,000 warriors have firearms. Not because it's a new technology to them. No, not at all. Perhaps 100 years before this battle takes place, Creeks have transitioned to firearms. It's not because they prefer to use traditional weapons. They have no choice. A firearm in this period is useless if you don't have the other elements. You've got to have black powder, gunpowder. You've got to have lead. You have to have flint. Without those elements, the musket is no better than a club, a fairly worthless tool, truly. And we know that their supplies are already greatly lacking. The group that had gone down to Pensacola and had been attacked at Burncorn Creek early in July were seeking out supplies from the Spanish governor at Pensacola. 8 months into this conflict, supplies are worse. Now, as an act of desperation, in the Horseshoe Bend area, glass flints have been found, which makes you think, there's a lack of flint, glass will work. It'll create a spark, but it's an act of desperation when you don't have flint and you are using glass to make that musket go boom. Now, bows and arrows. Probably the most numerous weapon behind that barricade. Traditional weapon, an ancient weapon, a weapon that most of these men know how to use quite well because they've grown up learning to use that as they age. They hone their hunting skills with that weapon or that tool. Unfortunately, by 1814, it is an antiquated weapon on the battlefield. I cannot tell you that a single individual was killed with a bow in this battle. Many wounded, many, and many will suffer for the rest of their lives from those wounds. But I don't know that a single man was killed. The musket is what kills people. Slow-moving, heavy, soft lead ball. Ball moving about 1,000 feet per second. When it hits, it deforms. It mutilates tissue when it hits. People die from it. That is what, by 1814, is the state of the art on any battlefield in the world. We have, of course, if not the most practical weapon, something that is very important, the war club. Hard to tell from your perspective here, but that war club is painted red. It is the traditional symbol. Red, meaning war, the color of war. The war club, oftentimes in this period called the war stick, hence the name Red Sticks, literally referring to that symbol of war, the red stick, the red club, the name that these gentlemen will take on by the end of the Creek War anyway. The war club. And of course, those were used as a close combat weapon. Several accounts of people applying for pensions in later years, who were wounded. One of the 39th, one of the privates in the 39th had his sternum split by this war club, by a war club. Okay. very intense fighting. The battlefield is relinquished, and the fighting moves into the peninsula. Now we have a fight from two sides, and surrounding these secondary positions, the bulk of the day's fighting takes place. Battle is described as a 5-hour fight, swirling throughout the 100 acres. Somewhere in mid-afternoon, people who can escape will make their escape, and they will flee to the banks of the river and attempt to cross. Coffee has repositioned his force. When the Creek and Cherokee allies have come across, he's replaced their positions with those 700 Tennessee Mounted Riflemen. That's key because they have a rifle. Average range of the musket we looked at earlier is about 100 yards. The rifle is 300 yards. It gives them plenty of distance from this position to well inside the village of Tehopka. It's a very accurate weapon. And in a matter of time, between 250 and 300 warriors are shot trying to cross that river by these Tennessee militia riflemen who have surrounded the bend. The battle comes to an end with nightfall. As darkness falls on the peninsula, the fighting stops. Jackson will describe on the next day that perhaps as many as 20 people will escape. If we look at the numbers, and if there was 1,000 warriors gathered here, the body count on the morning of March 28th gives the number 557 counted on the field. Estimations from the people across river, the Tennessee militia officers, between 250, 300. Those numbers added together give a grand total between somewhere of 800 and 900 warriors killed in this battle. That would tell us that probably more than 20 people escaped, and I think that is the case. Between 100 and 200 people will escape this battlefield. But that number, 800 to 900, makes this the deadliest battle in American history for an Indian force in American history, United States history. That's key. A relatively small patch of ground in Alabama is the deadliest battle for an American Indian force in United States history. As the battle ends, of course, the story continues. Jackson will retrace his steps to Fort Williams the next morning. Those that have escaped will gather south at Elkahatchee Creek. After 3 days of letting themselves bleed, Manawa and his warriors will purify their wounds in that 3-day period, and then will allow themselves to have their wounds tended to. Now, many of these names will go on to greater events in history. Certainly Jackson. The event here will take him from being a Tennessee militia officer to within a few weeks a brigadier general in the United States Army, and then very rapidly a major general in the United States Army with the task of defending the Gulf Coast, which will lead to the Battle of New Orleans. Horseshoe Bend is the stepping stone to New Orleans, which is, of course, the event that will put Jackson into the White House. Manawa will remain in the area and will continue to be a significant leader for the people on the Upper Tallapoosa. And he will, oddly enough, hold the commission as General of the United States Army in the First Seminole War in later years. The peace treaty that is conducted at the place where I now work, Fort Jackson. Siege, this is in August 1814, August 9th, 1814, will cede nearly 23 million acres of land to the United States. That land a portion of it will go to the already existing state of Georgia. The bulk of that will create, in essence, the state of Alabama. So, in many ways, Horseshoe Bend is kind of a key element in the formation of this state. The Creek Nation will continue to reside here. It's been oftentimes linked that this battle will ultimately, the Creek War leads to removal. It does. You could certainly make that argument, but removal, remember, is really 1836. It's still 20-odd years into the future. The area where Horseshoe Bend is located remains predominantly Creek country well into Alabama statehood. I know we're up against the time, so if I could turn over at this point to questions and answers, that might be appropriate.
If you have a question, raise your hand. Georgia Ann and I will see that you get a microphone and speak into the microphone so that attendees in the Milo auditorium can hear your question. Thank you.
I was wondering about the count of women and children that perished, and how do we come up with a figure?
Of women and the count of women and children that perished in the battle.
And the number that survived.
There's two things to look at. The bulk of the women and children become prisoners of the Cherokee and Creek Allies, and that is a round number that we're given. It says some 350 women and children go to these to the Cherokee and Creek, and you can trace their movements as they draw supplies from the forts as they move north. Now, the only thing, there's one point in one of Jackson's reports that alludes to how many women and children are killed. Only one. There's only one comment on, or one note of that, and he says, regrettably, 4 or 5 women or children are killed. That's it. There is no other note historically for that. That's our best information.
Quick technical question. The map describes 7 secondary redoubts or fortified positions. Is that correct? 1. 2, describes 15 dugout canoes. Is that approximately correct? 3, what is the capacity of those, or expected to be the capacity of those dugout canoes in ferrying warriors across the river?
Okay, I'll answer that last one first, which I have no idea. There's nothing that says what the capacity of the canoes, and I'm not even going to make a guess on that to give anybody wrong information. What map do you refer to when you talk about the other numbers?
The map previous to this slide.
It actually has numbers?
No, it shows 7
Oh,
redoubts.
ignore. That's just. I made the choice to limit numbers for aesthetic value. There's no idea. As far as canoes, it's described as hundreds. That's the historical description, is hundreds. For the fallback positions, there is no number. There is no number, and we obviously know a lot less than we know about those fallback positions. And it's a relatively recent interpretation based on the pension records that we're now starting to look at that describe these positions. In fact, it's on one of these positions that Sam Houston, I ignored Sam Houston today, is wounded on the attack on one of these positions. There is no number ever given for these. It just says scattered throughout the bend. So, yeah, there's no precise numbers. Yep.
This row.
You
Okay.
were talking about the field battle, and that Chaco, being an open field battle. What was there a village in that Chaco also? And where was the open field battle considerably away from where the village was?
Okay, when I say open field battle, don't take that as a literal, meaning that we have an open field. What that means is that there's no fixed fortifications. There's a battlefield that involves maneuver or movement. There is a village for that, and we don't know how close it was to any village. There's an Amukfall Creek village. There's an Chopka village, but we have no idea how close. In fact, we don't know where these battles are. We just have
We really don't know where the village.
That's absolutely right. No one knows. Or if they do tell you they know, I would be suspicious of that. Absolutely.
I've got a map that shows that.
And a lot depends on what year those maps are, because these town sites move around. You have to really nail it down to a point in time. Otherwise, you shouldn't extrapolate from one year to another unless it's right in that time frame. And a lot of historic maps, and we don't want to take the authors of these maps, especially at the time, to task, but they're not always reliable either. They make mistakes on these things. Yes?
What archaeological work has been done at Horseshoe Bend?
There's two, question in case for everybody's benefit. What archaeological work has been done at Horseshoe Bend? The two major excavations, one in 1962, done by Fairbanks. The second, about 1972. I am starting to brain dump everything. I forgot the gentleman's name who did the Dickens. There it is, Dickens. 1972. The Dickens excavation is the most important for us because he spent 6 weeks in the park, 2 weeks at 3 sites. The barricade, 2 weeks there. Other than the written reports of the barricade, our solid evidence comes from what he uncovered of that barricade. So most of what we know comes from his work at 2 weeks there. 2 weeks in New Yucca, both Dickens and Fairbanks, they covered mostly the same areas. Fairbanks he looked in some of the wrong areas and wasn't a terribly fruitful project. Now, they both looked in Tohoku, finding very little, and the same with New Yucca. Of both of those, the greatest information came from the 2 weeks with the barricade work. Now, in more recent years, there hasn't been any professional excavation since Dickens. But we've had some non-invasive work done in 2004 and 2005, doing ground penetrating radar to look at things in the immediate vicinity of the barricade. I thought we would find very little since most of this battlefield was farmed for decades. I was expecting little to be found, but in just about a 3-day period, some 250 battle-related artifacts were found. So there's still a lot out there, much more than I thought. Now, just this past summer, there was another non-invasive project which sought to map out the barricade position, something that the park has wanted to know exactly for a long time, how that barricade ran on the ground. And if you come to the symposium on Saturday at Auburn University, you will learn about the secrets of that.
Question concerning the troops. There were troops from North Carolina engaged in the Creek War somewhere.
That's right.
They were not at Horseshoe Bend.
No, they will come into the picture later in the story.
Later, after,
Yep.
after this battle and during the time the treaty was signed in 1860.
Right.
What part of North Carolina were they from?
I'll get with him after this.
That'll work. Because I'm not even going to. I will tell you that North Carolina troops are not involved in Horseshoe Bend. They do factor into the Creek War story, most significantly a little later on, and very significantly at Fort Toulouse-Jackson for construction of that. But yeah, I don't want to steer you wrong in any detail. So if you would see with Jim Parker,
Yeah, that's Parker.
he'll help you on that one particularly. What else do we have?
How many
Oh, but microphone there.
We
Oh,
have
sorry.
time for one more question.
I'll be around here plenty of time after this.
casualties were there to Jackson's?
Oh, good. I always forget a lot of good things to say. 49 killed. This is an all-inclusive number from that day. Cherokee Creek, militia, regular. 49 killed that day that remain behind. Montgomery, buried on the field. The others sunk in the water to prevent mutilation afterwards. So, 49 killed, 154 wounded. Those wounded will be taken back to Fort Williams, many of which will die in the following weeks. And of course, they're associated with that cemetery there at Fort Williams, which a lot of people know about. So, 49 killed, 154 wounded. Those are the casualty statistics for Jackson's force. Now, it's probably not a surprise The bulk of those casualties are going to come from the 39th on the attack on the barricade, and from the, by proportion of their numbers, from the Cherokee and Creek allies that crossed the river. Those three organizations suffer the greatest number of casualties, and if you look at the numbers involved, they're pretty close to even. However, by proportion. Tennessee militia is not, they are not used in the assault on this battle, and they actually suffer very few casualties. Probably the cannoneers suffer the greatest casualties in the first parts of this battle, as they're somewhat exposed in the initial 2 hours of the battle. I guess that's it for the questions. Yeah. Thank you.